So, Alan, the question for this section of variations is based on panels 7 and 8 of the exhibit. How about the reinterpretation of the Bogota houses from what has been called the Neo-Tudor or Tudor Revival style and its extension in Bogota? Panel 7 shows the mapping of this style that has been extended in almost 30 quarters of the city with 1,500 houses, which is a unique case in Latin America. The mapping was done based on panel number 8, where we define the elements of style, as we call them, where we quantified according to their presence in their houses. So the elements are architectural components that qualify the spatial structure of the house, both if it corresponds to the intermediate hall or its variations. Alan, what is your opinion about these elements of the style and the extensive number of these type of houses of the English style in Bogota?
Well, I was fascinated to learn about these houses and how many there are, and would like to know more about how England was perceived and why this particular style was popular at this time, rather than, for example, a French model, which one might imagine, whether it's to do with direct contact with English life and style, whether English people are in Bogota, whether it comes from the literature, and indeed everything else about it, which there won't be time to explain in detail. I think I would say I would never mistake any of these houses for being in England. And I haven't quite worked out how, but they just are different. And in terms of their middle halls, they appear to play a different role, perhaps not very different to what we've seen already. And they are really just sort of central circulation spaces of the kind that runs through the 19th century in England, that you need to join the rooms up. And a hall is a very convenient way to do that in planning terms. And also, if it accommodates the staircase, you get it all in one space. And more specialized rooms form a kind of periphery around this central exchange space, if you like. So I think that's all I have to say at this point.
The simulation of this English style, as we saw yesterday, not only has determined a specific period of the city of Bogota, but still marks the image today in some of the quarters of the center or the northern part of the city. This section will demonstrate empirically the extension of this phenomenon through the mapping that was made based on some quantifiable data that was taken in this territory. These cases was done by identifying and breaking down those architectonic elements that are part of the Tudor style, the windows, the roofs, the dormers, all of that, all the elements of the facade, and the regularity and accuracy with which these standards of the style were applied shows a broad margin of diversification with regards to those urban characteristics and social and economic characteristics of the areas of the city. So here we have these parameters for measurement, and this is how we could get an area for the study with approximately 30 of the barrios, as we call them in Spanish, or the quarters of the city, where there were about 1,500 houses that are still there, plus some others that have disappeared, especially in the northern side of the country. So these elements imply a spectrum of variations that the architects applied in a very aware or conscious manner. In more popular barrios, as we call them, they were copied in a more informal and spontaneous manner. So the mapping is a key factor of our investigation and allowed us to verify the propagation of these style houses in the city, establishing something unexpected in the context of Latin America. Okay, in architecture, there's an analytical approach that makes a difference between the type and style. So in the investigation, we believe that different styles can have the same formal structure, a type of architectonic that is designated in this case as a house with an intermediate hall. In the exhibition, we see this throughout time in a visible way in order to describe the house of English style, the eclectic garden houses, and many of the modern movement. The houses of the colonial urban houses, instead of the hall, had a patio as the main element, even though they can have a main room. We can also see here a comparison of a colonial urban house where you have the way to come in like a porch that goes to a patio where you can have one or more entrances. In the English house also, you have a porch that is before a main hall, for instance, and then the special area is not equivalent. In the first case, we see a street where you go through the porch and you can see the different entrances without threatening the privacy. While in the tradition of the English houses, privacy is kept with a passage that where you have to have and turn 90 degrees to see the hall. Although the characteristics of the English house, not only the roof and the Neptune arch and the windows, etc., are the ones that, as a sign of a language, allow to identify them within the tissue of Bogota. So we ask ourselves here if also the architectonic type could be considered as another element of the style, despite of not having a semantic value, but just syntactic one. In other words, because it belongs to the form of the house and not to its figure or appearance.
I'd like to highlight that the intermediate hall, despite its apparent rigidity, allowed for variations in its composition. The original Tudor house in England had a flexible relationship between the internal distribution of the house and how it related to the exterior and its vertical development, both in section and elevation. The middle hall allowed various accents through vertical axes related to the bay window, the chimneys, and the gables, which tended to break the axial symmetry, more typical of Italian and French traditions. This flexibility in the composition of the facade was well understood and assimilated by the Bogotá architects. In Bogotá, rather than a generic English style, it seems appropriate to speak of a reinterpretation of what has been called Neo-Tudor or Tudor Revival as a plausible late influence of the arts and crafts movement. This stylistic influence allows us to understand better some features that tend to be generalized within the architectural elements that make up the house. Along with the front garden, these elements were the pitched roofs, the chimneys, the gable, the attic, the doors, the shape of the windows, the use of the bay window, the mullions, and the facade materials such as exposed brickwork, stonework, or timber frame. As Victor has just pointed out, the imaginative use and combination of these elements produced variations that the architects applied thoroughly and consciously, while builders working in popular neighborhoods also did, but in a more informal and spontaneous way.
Thank you. There are so many different things to think about here. And indeed, this brings us into contact with some of the fundamental ways of interpreting architecture generally as function and as image. And my feeling is that most of the way that architecture is considered assumes rationality. But perhaps this is wrong. When I was thinking about the development of modern architecture in England in particular, I thought about the question of metaphor. Now, a metaphor is a figure of speech in which, in order to describe something, you use a term which is unlike the thing itself. And that way you recreate the meaning of something that is maybe overfamiliar. So looking at some of the houses of the 1920s in England, where the arts and crafts had perhaps become overripe, over-exaggerated, a caricature of itself. And if you look through the books and magazines of this period, not all of them are like that, but some of them are. They have to strive for more and more effect and become more exaggerated in their forms. And I thought, well, this is a house portrayed as a house. And in the end, that's not interesting. That's a kind of cliche, a tautology. You know, we don't want to understand a house by showing a house. We want to know something different about a house. So we make a house into a hospital, a factory, which is what a modern house is. And that way we recover some of the qualities of houseness because we are testing them through the metaphor. I hope this isn't too far-fetched or extraordinary. But what I see in the houses of Bogota is this essentially completely irrational adoption of a language that has no place to be in Bogota culturally, but obviously serves a purpose. It is making a picture of a house-like house for people who do not otherwise have that image. And perhaps it is satisfying to the people who are there because there's no other explanation for it that I can think of. It is entirely irrational. But it obviously was very popular. It satisfied people's emotional needs. And that is what I perceive from this, rather more than the very specific things about house planning or style or decoration, is a more general sense of deploying an architectural language in a, as I say, a poetic way, if you like. The larger question around this, I think, is are we still doing this without knowing it? Because I suspect it's unconscious in many cases. What do we think of architectural language? I feel very strongly about this, that architects are always engaged in linguistic generation of meaning and activity, but often they don't know what they're doing. Maybe it's better that way. It's only later, perhaps, that the historians can come along and try and interpret it. So I think I'm happy to give you this rather heretical interpretation of architectural language, and I would be interested in any responses.